There are lots of things we can do to help our houseplants get through those colder months, and one of the things that I would recommend is maximising the amount of light your plants get. Now this is really important because during the winter there is less light. You want to really try and make sure your houseplants have access to as much as possible. So there are several ways you can do this. One thing you can do is you can make sure your windows are clean. I know it sounds really simple, but if your windows are clean, more light can get through. And at the same time, also make sure the leaves of your plants are clean, because if there's dust on a plant's leaves, then it's going to find it more difficult to absorb light. So that's another way you can maximize light. And another thing you can do, and this is something that I always do every winter, is that you can move your plants closer to the window. So plants that like a lot of light, you can kind of move them much closer to the window. In the summer there tends to be more direct sun, so you might have moved your plants a little bit further away. I know I do that in summer, but during winter what I usually do is I just move them as close as possible. And this is especially useful for alocasias too, because alocasias are known for kind of losing their leaves in the colder weather. So I always make sure my alocasias are right near a window. And you can do it with all of your plants too, providing it's not a plant that is a low light plant. If you've got plants that are more low light plants, then you may want to put them a little bit back from the window and just prioritize that space for the plants that like bright and direct light. Now, in general, the bigger the plant, the more robust it's going to be and the more leaves it's going to have. Therefore, it's going to be more established and more able to get through the winter. So if you have smaller plants like baby plants, I'd recommend putting these quite near the window too, because smaller plants, they're not quite as well established and they're kind of a little bit more vulnerable. You could also use a grow light. This is another way that you can maximize light. You don't have to do this, of course, but there are lots of grow lights on the market these days, and yeah, it just gives your plants that extra bit of light that they won't be getting. I don't leave my grow lights on 24/7. I mimic the kind of sunlight that they would get during summer, so I usually have them on for 15 hours and then they get turned off, and yeah, it just seems to give them that extra little boost. Another really helpful tip I can give you is that you will probably need to reduce your watering. Most plants tend to grow less in the winter, so they're using less resources because they're not growing as much. Therefore, you may find that if your plant needs watering weekly in the summer, maybe it will only need watering every 2 weeks during the winter. And I'd really recommend that you don't just guess when your plant needs watering. Put your finger into the soil and just see if it's dry before you water, because plants are really vulnerable to root rot during winter, because a lot of people don't realise that you need to water them less, and they do tend to stay wetter for longer, especially when there's less light. So root rot can be a problem. So just make sure that you're always checking that soil before you water. Don't water on a schedule. You can also get a moisture meter if you're unsure. These are really useful. I still use one of these. It just takes the guesswork out. So you've probably heard it said out there, people say to stop fertilising during the winter, and this is partially true. What I usually do is, if a plant is not growing, I will stop fertilising because it doesn't need those nutrients if it's gone into a sort of a dormant period. If the plant is still growing, and some plants do still grow over winter, then I usually just give it a half strength fertiliser, because normally they're not growing quite as fast. So you can either reduce or stop the fertiliser depending on the plant. Just see how your individual plant grows and yeah, tailor it from there. During the winter months, of course, lots of us use our heating to keep the house warm for ourselves, to keep us comfortable. Now, what this can do for your plants is it can dry out the air, and yeah, it can dry your plants out. So you will want to keep an eye on that. I would just avoid putting your plants kind of really near to a heater that's on quite a lot. The other thing to remember about heating as well is that it creates the perfect kind of dry environment that spider mites love. So make sure you still keep an eye out for pests during winter. I think a lot of people think because the temperature's cool, it means there won't be any pests, but spider mites absolutely love dry conditions, so do keep an eye out for that. So another subject that a lot of people get concerned about is, should you repot your plants during winter? And what I would say is, try not to repot your plant during winter. The reason for this is because they're not growing, therefore when you repot the plant it's more vulnerable to transplant shock, because in spring when you repot a plant it's actively growing and it's more likely to recover, but during winter it's likely to not be growing as much. So that's the reason why most people say try not to repot. However, if there's a reason you need to repot your plant, such as it is root bound, or you just bought a new plant and you think it's in awful soil and you just have to change the soil, of course just go ahead and do it, it will be fine. Another tip is, do not shut your plants behind the curtains during the winter months because it gets very cold behind there. So yeah, if you usually do that during summer without thinking, during winter you may want to avoid doing that because it can get quite cold and icy behind curtains, especially in the evening. So as I've mentioned already, loads of houseplants tend to slow down with their growth during winter. Some stop completely and just stay the same until spring comes around. Some might grow a little bit more slowly, but there are occasions when a plant will die back completely. An example of this would be the Oxalis triangularis. This one, if it gets too cold, it does tend to die back, and then a lot of people think that's it, the plant's gone. But actually this is a plant that comes back next year. It actually has kind of, I think you call them rhizomes under the soil. They're kind of like bulbs, I guess, but you can replant these come spring and the plant will grow back again. Similarly, if you have an alocasia that happens to die back, sometimes alocasias do this, they lose all of their leaves and people think that they've gone completely, but if you hang on to the plant you'll probably find some little tiny bulbs in the soil. These are called corms. You can replant these again next year and you'll get a new plant. So yeah, don't give up on your alocasia, and there are certain other plants that also die back and come back next year. So before you throw it out, maybe just do some research to find out if you've got one of those plants that could come back next year. I personally don't tend to find that my alocasias die back completely during winter, and I think this is because I make sure that I move them close to the light source. I also make sure to monitor the watering, even though alocasias like to stay moist. Of course, just like any other plant, they need less water during winter, so I make sure to keep that watering balance right for them, and they usually tend to make it through. They don't grow, I don't tend to get any new leaves, so I do stop fertilising, but yeah, putting them nearer to the light, it definitely works, so if you can do that then definitely do it. If you enjoyed this video, I think you might like this one, so feel free to check it out, and I'll see you in the next video.